It doesn't begin with a big decision, not a diet, not a complete lifestyle overhaul. Just one evening, you don't eat. You tell yourself, it's fine, it's just one skipped meal. Maybe you think it's good for you, or maybe you simply don't feel hungry yet. But while you scroll on your phone, watch videos, and eventually fall asleep, something inside your body has already begun to change. Your body notices. There are no obvious signs, but a quiet signal spreads. The familiar source of energy will not arrive tonight, and in that moment, your entire internal system begins to adjust. The body does not live by thoughts, it lives by rhythm. When you eat at the same time every day, your hormones, enzymes, and brain all learn to expect it. But when you skip a meal, that cycle is disrupted. The body does not ask why. It does only one thing. It adapts. In the first few hours, you barely feel anything. Everything seems normal, even lighter. But inside, insulin begins to drop. Not suddenly, just quietly declining. And as that happens, the body begins to shift states. The kidneys adjust, the liver changes its activity, and fat cells begin to receive signals for the first time in a long while. A few hours later, hunger appears, but it is not purely physiological. It is a blend of habit, memory, and dopamine. Your brain does not just remember food, it remembers the familiar feeling of dinner. When that disappears, the brain interprets it as lack. Not a lack of energy, but a lack of sensation. That's why you feel restless, slightly uncomfortable, even a bit empty. Not because you are weak, but because dopamine is dropping. And this is important. You are not just hungry, you are confronting a habit that has been programmed for a long time. But if you don't eat, if you let that feeling pass, the body does not collapse. It shifts into a backup mode, something humans have relied on for thousands of years. As insulin drops sufficiently, the liver begins to use glycogen, the body's short-term energy reserve, like cash in your wallet, not much, but enough when needed. This process happens so quietly that you barely notice it. You might just feel slightly colder or a bit more alert, but internally, the body is shifting from storing energy to releasing it. This is what we call metabolic flexibility, the ability to use multiple fuel sources. The problem is, we eat so frequently that the body forgets how to use stored energy. Like having money but not knowing how to spend it. And when you skip dinner, you are teaching your body something fundamental again. Energy does not only come from your most recent meal. As glycogen runs low, the body must choose, panic, or adapt. If you are healthy, it adapts. Fat begins to be released. The liver produces ketones, a fuel source many people have lost the ability to use efficiently. At first, you may feel tired, slightly lightheaded, unfamiliar with the sensation. And this is where many people stop. They think their body isn't suited for it. But in reality, this is not a lack of energy. It is a fuel transition. Like a car switching to a new system, it needs time to stabilize, and once it does, everything becomes smoother. As ketones rise, the brain begins to use them, and you can feel it, not as excitement, but as a quiet clarity. Your thoughts become sharper, less distracted. This makes perfect sense, evolutionarily. When food was scarce, humans needed to become more alert, not slower. So the body does not weaken you when you don't eat. It sharpens your focus. At the same time, growth hormone increases, helping preserve muscle, mobilize fat, and support repair. This shows that the body does not interpret a missed meal as danger, but as an opportunity to optimize. But at this point, the real challenge begins not in the body, but in the mind. As you move into the second or third day, hunger changes. It becomes less obvious, and you begin to ask yourself, am I truly hungry, or just used to eating? This is when many people realize something profound. Most of what we call hunger is actually programming. And when you begin to question whether you are truly hungry, a subtle shift takes place. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough to make you pause. Because for the first time, you don't immediately react to the sensation, you observe it. And if you observe long enough, you notice something you had never seen before. Hunger has a cycle. It comes, rises, and then fades away, even if you don't eat. This is a critical moment. Not because your body changes, but because your perception of your body begins to change. Before, hunger felt like a command. It appeared, and you responded instantly. But now, it feels like a signal, and a signal does not require immediate action. While you are still observing, something deeper begins to unfold inside your body. As glycogen is nearly depleted, the body no longer has an easy option. It is forced to go deeper into its reserves. Fat cells not only release energy, they begin to do so more efficiently. The liver not only produces ketones, it starts optimizing the process. And the brain, which was initially hesitant, begins to accept this new fuel source. This is why, on the second or third day, many people experience a very distinct feeling. Not always comfortable, but very clear. A kind of light fatigue mixed with alertness, a slight slowing in the body, but increased clarity in the mind. It feels as if your entire system is retuning its frequency. And if you don't return to your old habits, at that moment something else begins to happen. The noise starts to fade. The energy swings, the sharp spikes, followed by sudden crashes, begin to disappear. In their place comes a more stable energy curve. No peaks, no explosions, but steady and enduring. This is when many people experience, for the first time, a state they don't quite know how to name. It's not excitement, not stimulation, but a kind of very clean clarity. You don't need coffee to start your day. You're no longer pulled by sudden cravings. You're not constantly thinking about your next meal. Your mind has more space. This doesn't happen because you've become stronger. It happens because your biology is functioning more correctly. When ketones become a stable energy source, the brain no longer depends on the highs and lows of glucose. There are no more spikes and crashes that leave you feeling drained without knowing why. No more sense of, I need to eat something right now, just to maintain energy. Instead, there is a steady, almost quiet flow. At the same time, another process begins to accelerate silently, one that most of us have never directly felt, yet it influences everything. Autophagy. When the body is no longer constantly occupied with digestion, it finally has time to clean up. Damaged proteins are broken down. Inefficient structures are recycled. What is no longer needed is removed. This is not destruction. This is maintenance, quality control at the cellular level. And interestingly, you can begin to feel this, not in a direct way, but through very ordinary signals. You wake up feeling lighter. Your body no longer feels heavy after sleep. Your digestion becomes quieter. Your stomach is no longer bloated or tight. Even your skin begins to change, not because of magic, but because inflammation is decreasing. Hunger still exists at this stage, but it has changed. It is no longer urgent, no longer demanding. It feels more like a gentle signal than a pressure. And when you notice this, your relationship with food begins to shift. You are no longer eating to suppress a feeling. You begin to eat by choice. This is a profound shift, yet it often goes unnoticed because it is not dramatic. There is no explosive moment, no wow effect. Everything simply becomes easier, quietly. And then, at some point, usually after a few days, you realize that the thing that once scared you the most, hunger, is no longer frightening. It doesn't control you. It is simply part of the system. This is when your body begins to enter what science calls metabolic adaptation. But more simply put, this is when your body remembers how it was originally designed to function, flexible, self-regulating, and independent. But just as things begin to stabilize, another challenge appears, not in enduring hunger anymore, but in understanding your body deeply enough not to go too far. Because while the body can adapt, it still needs resources. It still needs balance. And this is where many people, after overcoming the hardest phase, unknowingly drift off course. When you reach the fourth day, something very unusual happens. It's not that hunger disappears completely. It's not that you suddenly feel full of energy. It's that everything begins to soften. That earlier sense of urgency, the need to eat, immediately loses its intensity. It's still there, but like a sound fading into the background instead of dominating your attention. And within that quiet, a deeper process begins to activate. This is when your body enters one of the most important mechanisms modern science has ever identified: autophagy, the process of cellular self-cleaning and recycling. But even that description is still too scientific. Imagine it this way. Over the years, your body accumulates debris, damaged proteins, inefficient structures, components that no longer function optimally. When you eat constantly, your body stays busy processing new energy, leaving no time to clean. But when you stop eating, especially after several days, it finally has the space to do that work. And it doesn't do it slowly. It does it decisively. What is no longer needed is broken down. What can still be used is recycled. What is essential is preserved and strengthened. This is not destruction. This is an upgrade. That's why many people begin to notice changes that are hard to explain. Not dramatic transformations like losing 5 kilograms in 3 days, but subtler shifts, feeling lighter upon waking, clearer in the morning, reduced low-grade inflammation like minor joint aches or lingering fatigue. This isn't imagination, this is biology at work. At the same time, your brain is also changing how it functions. When ketones become the primary fuel, neurons receive a far more stable energy supply than they do from glucose. No more spikes followed by crashes, no more alert then exhausted cycles throughout the day. Instead, there is a straight line, not high, but steady. And this stability creates a state many people describe as clarity. You're not pulled by scattered thoughts. You're not distracted by minor stimuli. You work, and you stay with it longer. Not because you're trying harder, but because your nervous system is no longer overwhelmed by noise. And it goes beyond focus. It reaches into emotion. As insulin stabilizes and inflammation decreases, neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and GABA begin to rebalance. You're no longer riding emotional highs and lows. Your responses become softer, with more space between stimulus and reaction. You don't react immediately, you have the space to choose. And this is one of the deepest changes that many people never expect. Your relationship with food begins to change at the root. Before, eating was a reflex. Sad, eat. Bored, eat. Tired, eat. Not hungry, but still eat. But now, as your internal signals become clearer, you begin to notice the difference between need and want. And those two things are not the same. You may still want to eat, but you are no longer compelled to eat. This is autonomy, not the kind of discipline that comes from forcing yourself, but a natural self-governance that arises because your body and brain are beginning to work in sync again. However, this is also where understanding becomes essential, because once things start getting better, many people make a mistake. They think they can keep pushing further. They cut food more aggressively, extend the fast longer, challenge the body harder. But the body does not need to be forced, it needs to be supported. Because while you are fasting, low insulin does more than burn fat, it also causes the kidneys to excrete more water and sodium. That means if you do not replace enough fluids and electrolytes, you may begin to feel dizzy, fatigued, or even experience a rapid heartbeat. And many people misunderstand this, assuming their body isn't suited for fasting, when in reality, it is simply a mineral imbalance. That is why, at this stage, subtlety matters more than willpower. You do not need to do more. You need to do it better. Drink enough water. Add a little salt. Eat nutrient-dense food when you do eat. Sleep enough. Keep the body in a stable state. And when you do that, something very interesting happens. Your body doesn't just adapt, it begins to cooperate. You no longer feel like you are fighting hunger. You no longer have to tell yourself to keep going. Everything starts to feel more natural. You eat when needed. You stop when satisfied. You move your body without feeling dragged down by low energy. This is when many people realize that what they once called discipline was often just an attempt to compensate for a system that was out of balance. And once that system is corrected, you no longer need to force yourself. But the journey does not end here. Because once you move beyond the 5th and 6th day, the body begins to enter an even deeper state, one in which not only energy changes, but your circadian rhythm, your sleep, and the way you experience an entire day begin to be rewritten. When you reach the 7th day, there is a very special moment that most people do not recognize right away. Nothing explodes. There is no dramatic sense of victory. But if you are sensitive enough, you notice something very different. Your body is no longer resisting you. Before that, everything felt like a tug of war. You tried to fast, and the body pushed back. You tried to control, and the mind demanded. But now, that tension disappears. You no longer feel like you are enduring anything. You are simply living in a different rhythm. This is precisely the point at which the body enters what science calls a state of metabolic adaptation. But in simpler terms, this is when your body begins to function the way it was originally designed to function. Fat is no longer a locked storage reserve. It becomes the primary fuel. And that changes everything. Before, your energy came in waves. Eat, feel alert. A few hours later, crash, then eat again. A cycle you thought was normal, but in reality, it was a sign of dependency. Now, your energy becomes flatter. Not especially high, but not crashing either. Stable in a way many people have never experienced before. And when energy is stable, the brain changes too. You are no longer pulled around by small impulses. You are no longer constantly thinking about food. You are no longer interrupted by sudden cravings for no clear reason. Your mind becomes quieter, and that quiet creates a different kind of focus, deeper, more sustained. This is when many people realize, for the first time, they were never truly lacking energy before. They were lacking access to energy. At the same time, deep inside the cells, another silent upgrade is taking place. Mitochondria, the body's energy factories, begin to increase in number, not in one day, but enough to create a noticeable difference after a week. More mitochondria means your body produces energy more efficiently, creates less metabolic waste, and tolerates stress better. This is not the feeling of euphoria. This is the feeling of durability. And interestingly, when the body begins producing energy more efficiently, the need to eat constantly decreases naturally. Not because you are forcing yourself, but because you no longer need to. Ghrelin, the hunger hormone, begins adapting to the new rhythm. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes more precise, less loud. You are no longer awakened by hunger at fixed hours simply because of old habit. Your body begins relearning how to communicate accurately. This is one of the deepest changes. Hunger becomes honest. You feel hungry when you truly need food, not when your brain merely remembers it. And when that happens, another hormone begins returning to its proper role. Leptin, the satiety hormone. In modern life, leptin is often ignored. You eat, yet still want more, not because the body needs it, but because the signal is not being heard. But when insulin drops and the system stabilizes, leptin begins working again. You feel the point of enough more clearly. This is when your relationship with food changes at a fundamental level. You no longer eat automatically. You are no longer trapped in cycles of eating guilt, eating again. You begin eating according to real need, but the change does not stop there. As you move into the 8th and 9th day, another process becomes more obvious. Fat burning is no longer a goal. It becomes the default state. Your body no longer has to try to use fat. It does so naturally. And this is where many people begin to notice more visible physical changes, not just on the scale, but in feeling lighter, less swollen, retaining less water. But more importantly, you begin to understand that fat is not the problem. It is unused energy. Every gram of fat burned is not something you are losing. It is something you are finally using correctly. At the same time, insulin, which stays chronically elevated in a constantly fed lifestyle, now becomes low and stable. And this opens one of the biggest benefits of all: improved insulin sensitivity. That means when you do eat again, the body handles glucose more efficiently, stores less, and fluctuates less. This is not just a story about body weight. It is a story about long-term metabolic health. But something even deeper is happening, and very few people talk about it. When energy is stable, when hormones are balanced, when hunger no longer dominates, you begin to experience something you may have forgotten: inner quiet. Not quiet because there is less stimulation, but quiet because there is no longer inner conflict. You are no longer fighting yourself, no longer negotiating. Eat or don't eat, continue or stop. Those inner dialogues which consume so much mental energy begin to fade, and when they fade, you have more space for everything else: work, creativity, connection, presence. This is not a side effect. It is part of the process, because when biology stabilizes, psychology stabilizes too. But at this point, a dangerous misunderstanding can appear. When everything starts to feel better, many people begin to believe they have found the answer, and they try to maintain this state forever. They keep extending, keep cutting back, keep pushing further. And that is when the system begins to move out of balance again, because the body was not designed to live in constant deprivation. Just as it was not designed to live in constant excess, it was designed for rhythm, times of eating and times of resting, times of replenishment and times of recovery. And as you approach the 10th day, your body begins to send subtle signals to remind you of this. Not through collapse, but through gentle signs: slightly more fatigue, a bit more coldness, or simply the feeling that it is time to replenish. This is not failure. This is the body's intelligence. And if you listen at the right moment, you do not just preserve what you have gained, you bring your system to a higher level of balance. When you step into the 11th day, something happens that is very difficult to put into words. But if you have reached this point, you will feel it immediately. It is not that you suddenly have more energy in an explosive way. It is not that you become superhuman. It is that everything feels lighter. Your mind is no longer stretched tight. You do not need stimulation to begin the day. You are simply alert, clear, and present. This is not motivation. This is chemistry. When your brain has adapted to using ketones, a series of deeper changes begins to unfold. Oxidative stress levels decrease. Neurons no longer have to handle constant energy fluctuations the way they do when dependent on glucose. And more importantly, the body begins increasing production of something neuroscientists call BDNF, a kind of fertilizer for the brain. It helps neural connections grow stronger, become more flexible, and recover more effectively. You do not feel BDNF directly, but you feel its effects. You focus longer without trying. You think more clearly without becoming mentally exhausted. Tasks that once triggered procrastination now feel easier to begin, not because you are more disciplined, but because your nervous system is functioning more efficiently. And interestingly, when the brain becomes more stable, emotions begin to change too. You no longer react as quickly as before. No more obvious emotional highs and lows. A small space appears between stimulus and response, and that space gives you choice. You begin to realize that many of your past behaviors did not come from real need. They came from reflex, from habit, from loops you had never truly questioned. This is when your relationship with food changes on an even deeper level. It is no longer just eat or don't eat. It becomes understanding why you want to eat. There are moments when you realize you are not hungry, yet still want food because you feel sad, bored, or in need of something familiar. And for the first time, you can see that without being pulled into it. This is not control. This is awareness. Alongside the changes in your brain, your body is also continuing to adjust on another level, the gut. After many days without having to work continuously, the digestive system begins to truly rest. Gut bacteria have time to rebalance. The intestinal lining begins to recover. Inflammation decreases. You may not notice this in a single day, but you will feel it through very ordinary signals: a lighter stomach, less bloating, smoother digestion. A kind of quiet in the body that you may never have noticed before, simply because you had become used to low-grade discomfort lasting all the time. And when the gut becomes more stable, the brain becomes more stable too, because these two systems are always connected. What happens in the gut does not stay in the gut. It affects mood, focus, and the way you experience your entire day. This is when many people realize that they are not just changing the way they eat. They are changing the way they feel their body. Hunger is no longer a frightening signal. It becomes information, a form of communication. You understand it instead of reacting to it. And this leads to a very deep change. You begin to trust your body more. For many years, you may have viewed the body as something that needed to be controlled. You had to eat on time. You had to restrain yourself. You had to force it. But now, when you see that it can self-regulate, self-adapt, and self-balance, you begin to see it as a partner, not as a problem that needs fixing. This is a psychological shift, but it begins in biology. However, at this exact point, a very subtle challenge appears. When things start becoming easier, you may forget that the body still needs nourishment. Fasting is not the same as ignoring nutrition. And if your remaining meals lack protein, minerals, and micronutrients, the body will begin to send signals, not immediately, but enough for you to feel slightly more tired, slightly colder, or sometimes mildly dizzy. This is not failure. It is a reminder, because no matter how flexible the body is, it still needs raw materials to build and repair. One of the least talked about but most important changes at this stage is the shift in electrolyte balance. When insulin stays low for an extended period, the kidneys excrete more sodium and water. If you do not replenish enough, you can become dehydrated without realizing it. And this is often misunderstood as fasting doesn't suit me, when in reality, it is simply a lack of salt and minerals. That is why small details, such as drinking enough water, adding a little salt, and eating nutrient-dense foods become more important than ever. Not to optimize, but to keep the system stable. And when you maintain that stability, the benefits no longer stop at energy or body weight. You begin to feel something deeper: connection. Not emotional connection in the usual sense, but the connection between you and your own body. You understand its signals. You know when to eat and when to stop. You no longer need rigid rules, because you now have internal data. This is the point where the journey stops being just a 4-day experiment. It becomes an experience, a process of relearning how the body works. And when you reach day 13, day 14, the external changes may become more visible. You may be lighter. Your face may look leaner. But if you stop there, you miss the most important part. Because what truly changes is not what you can see. It is how you feel yourself. You no longer live by habit. You no longer eat by reflex. You are no longer driven by signals you do not understand. You begin to live more consciously. And that is the greatest change of all. And then, when you look back over the whole journey from one simple evening of not eating to 2 full weeks passing, you begin to realize something you may never have thought about before. The biggest transformation was not in your body. It was in how you understand your body. Because over these past days, you didn't just fast, you observed, you experienced. You saw clearly how hunger comes and goes, how energy does not disappear when you do not eat, how your body, when given space, can self-regulate, self-balance, and self-repair. And that breaks one very deep belief of modern life, that we must constantly take in something in order not to fall apart. But now you've seen it. You did not fall apart. In fact, in many moments, you became clearer, steadier, and lighter. However, this is also where a very easy misunderstanding can happen. Many people, after experiencing this, start to think, then the longer I fast, the better. But that is not how biology works. The body was not designed to live in constant excess, but it was also not designed to live in constant deprivation. It was designed for rhythm. There are times to eat, times to rest, times to refuel, times to recover. What you have just experienced is not a lifestyle meant to be maintained forever. It is a reset, a way of reminding the body how it was always meant to function. And this is the part many people overlook. How you return to eating afterward matters just as much as the days you spent fasting. If you go back to your old habits, eating constantly, eating emotionally, eating without awareness, the body will gradually return to its old state. Not because this method does not work, but because the environment is no longer aligned. But if you keep what you have learned, listening to hunger, eating when needed, stopping when satisfied, prioritizing real food, then these changes do not disappear. They become your new foundation. And that is the real goal. Not fasting to lose weight, not a 1-4-day challenge to prove your willpower, but relearning how to live in a body you understand. There is one more thing that must be said clearly, because not everyone should apply this in the same way. For people with medical conditions, those taking blood sugar regulating medications, or those with a history of eating disorders, a sudden change in eating patterns can create real risks. In those cases, medical supervision is not optional, it is necessary. Even for healthy people, if you go too far, cut back too aggressively, ignore nutrition, or use fasting as a way to punish your body, the system will react. Not because it is weak, but because it is trying to protect you. Biology does not reward extremity. It rewards appropriateness. And once you understand that, you stop being pulled into all or nothing methods. You become more flexible. Some days you eat fully, some days you eat less, sometimes you fast, sometimes you refuel. And all of that can coexist within one balanced system. This is exactly what your body was designed to do from the beginning, before fixed meal schedules, before food was available 24/7, before the idea that you must eat on time. Human beings evolved in variability, and it is that variability that creates adaptive strength. And now, after 14 days, you do not just understand that in theory. You have experienced it. You have seen what your body can do when it is no longer constantly interrupted. You have seen how quiet your mind can become when it is no longer pulled by small impulses. You have seen that hunger is not the enemy, it is a signal. And perhaps the most important thing you take from this journey is not a number on the scale, but a feeling, the feeling that you are no longer dependent, the feeling that you have a choice, the feeling that your body does not need to be controlled, only understood. So when you sit down for your next meal, pause for a moment, not to restrain yourself, not to analyze, but simply to realize you are eating because you choose to, not because you have to. And if there is one thing this journey can leave with you, it is this. Sometimes, what nourishes you most is not what you put in. It is the time you give your body to rest. If you have come this far, ask yourself one very simple question. Are you willing to listen to your body one more time? And if the answer is yes, then begin not with a big plan, but with one small choice, just as everything began. One evening, you do not eat.